Last time we spoke about the Battle of Nanshan. After their loss at the Battle of Yalu, the Russians began a withdrawal while trying to delay the Japanese advance upon Port Arthur. The 2nd IGA of General Oku landed at Pizo along the Liaodong Peninsula to open the path to Port Arthur and cut her off from reinforcements from the rest of Manchuria. General Oku first had the 4th IGA Division seize Chinchou before bombarding Nanshan from both land and the sea. The Russian defenders, led by Colonel Tretyakov, fought like lions, exacting a terrible price upon the Japanese. But ultimately, it was the foolish General Foch who made a blunder of things, resulting in a chaotic withdrawal. Nanshan was seized, and General Nogi with the 3rd IGA began to land at Takushan, ready to pounce on the prize of Dalny. Dalny was seized without a fight, and now Nogi's men prepared to besiege Port Arthur. This episode is the Russo-Japanese War Part 4, the Russian counteroffensive at Telissu. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. Before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released an episode in both French and English on France's role during the Pacific War. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. This month's exclusive podcast over there is on Yang Kyung-jong, a Korean man who fought for the Japanese, the Soviets, and the Germans during World War II. But is his story actually true? Come find out. As we have seen at the battles of Yalu and Nanshan, the Russians seemed to have an enormous strategic problem. The core of the problem was the fact that the Tsar appointed General Kuropatkin to lead the war, but left the real power in the hands of Admiral Alexev. There were clear philosophical differences between the two men. Hell, one was an admiral trying to lead land battles. Kuropatkin understood logistics better. He knew they needed to bide time so that more men could travel aboard the Trans-Siberian over to the Far East so a proper offensive could be made. But Alexev and his financial friends in the Royal Timber Company feared losing their investments in Manchuria. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, Alexev's appointment of viceroyalty was actually the brainchild of Alexander Bezobrezov, who recommended it to the Tsar. In many ways, the Russo-Japanese War was fought for financial benefit of some elites in Russia, and this would help stroke revolutionary fever back home. Kuropatkin was not 100% sure of the Japanese disposition and intentions. The 1st IGA beat them at the Yalu, and it seemed that they were heading northwest towards Liaoyang. The 2nd IGA landed at Pizo, defeated them at Nanshan, and now held Dalny. The 10th Division, the nucleus of what will soon be the 4th IGA, had landed at Takushan, while the 3rd IGA seemed to still be in Japan. Kuropatkin wrote in his memoirs, "It was incumbent on us, therefore, to exercise great caution and to keep our forces as far as possible concentrated, so as to be ready to meet the attack of 2 or even 3 armies. The slow pace of the Trans-Siberian Railway to reinforce him by May was causing Kuropatkin to seriously consider withdrawing from Liaoyang to Mukden. But the Tsar and the court demanded he go on the offensive to try and rescue Port Arthur. Alexev's chief of staff, Jalinsky, went to Kuropatkin with basically 2 options. Option number 1, contain the 2nd IGA and attack the 1st IGA and the 4th IGA in the direction of the Yalu. Option number 2, perform an offensive against the 2nd IGA to the north of Port Arthur while blocking the 1st IGA. Neither option was good, but Kuropatkin ultimately chose the second option. Kuropatkin believed an attack from the direction of Liaoyang would leave the Russian right flank and rear exposed to a possible landing of the 3rd IGA. Kuropatkin's staff believed such a landing might occur at Yingkou. Having to allocate troops to protect his right flank and rear, Kuropatkin only had 60 to 70 of his 94 battalions in mid-May. The railway did not run towards Yalu, therefore his logistical lines would be terrible. Feeding such an immense army was not easy. Over on the other side, General Nogi, who had once commanded the 1st IGA Brigade that took Port Arthur in 1894, was given initially the 1st and 11th Divisions for the same task in 1904. However, it soon became very apparent he required, at minimum, 4 divisions for the job. His force began a siege against Port Arthur, and this in turn affected Kuropatkin's situation. Port Arthur had been provisioned to sustain 12 battalions for 12 months. But now it held 27 battalions and an enormous amount of refugees from places like Dalny. It was theorized to only be able to hold out for perhaps 6 months. On May the 23rd, Zhilinsky arrived to Kuropatkin's HQ at Liaoyang, whereupon he gave him the 2 options I had mentioned. Kuropatkin thought both options were idiotic, and he screamed at Zhilinsky, unwilling to comply. Alexev proposed sending the case straight to the Tsar. Thus, both Kuropatkin and Alexev sent reports to the Tsar. Alexeyev's report drew attention to losing the navy, and that of Port Arthur, stating that would lose them the war based on a loss of morale. Kuropatkin explained in his report that going on an offensive southwards would simply expose his army to a devastating attack, and it would be better to hold out at Liaoyang and build up strength. He also advised that Port Arthur held no real tactical significance anymore. The Tsar convened a council of war, and they all agreed if Port Arthur fell, the incoming Baltic fleet would have nowhere to turn to. Thus, Kuropatkin was instructed to rescue Port Arthur. In June of 1904, General Kuroki's 1st IGA was due north of Yalu, heading for Liaoyang. To confront them was Lieutenant General Keller and Major General Rennenkampf. Yes, that crazy badass from the last war. They had roughly 23,000 infantry, 3,600 cavalry, and over 90 guns of various caliber. General Oku's 2nd IGA, meanwhile, were going to be confronted by the 1st Siberian Corps of Lieutenant General Stackelberg, who had 30,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and over 100 guns. Within the 2nd IGA's center was General Nozu's 10th IGA Division, who would be confronted by Major General Mishenka's Cossack Brigade. To the rear at Liaoyang and Mukden was General Kuropatkin, with his growing force of over 36,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 120 guns. The European 21st Division had just arrived, and the 10th Army Corps, plus 2 cavalry divisions, were en route. As you can see, the Russians were being forced to separate their forces by the Japanese. If they consolidated, the Russians would be a force to be reckoned with. The Russians' strategic lifeline, their greatest advantage, was the railway. Any threat to it would crush the Russian war effort. This was something that deeply troubled Kuropatkin at all times. He would have 55,000 men deployed just to defend the line between the Ural Mountains and the Manchurian frontier. Within Manchuria, a force of 25,000 men was assigned to protect the lines there as well. Meanwhile, every strategic point, such as railway bridges, were being attacked by Honghu-zi, and they were under the direct guidance of Japanese officers. Now, the Qing were officially telling the Russians they were doing everything they could to thwart the Honghu-zi menace, but in reality, they were doing pretty much nothing at all. In a single month, over 90 major attempts to disrupt the railway would occur between Mukden and Tailing. On June the 7th, Kuropatkin visited Stackelberg at his HQ to give him verbal orders to accompany the written ones he received. Your Excellency's Army Corps is detailed with the object of drawing upon itself the greatest possible number of the enemy forces, and thereby weakening his army operating in the Guangdong Peninsula. Your advance, therefore, against the enemy's covering troops must be rapid and energetic, in the hope of crushing his advanced detachments should they prove to be weak in numbers. In the event of you encountering superior strength, decisive action will be avoided, and in no case will you allow the whole of your reserves to become engaged until the conditions are entirely clear. The object of our southerly movement is the capture of Qinzhou. and thereafter an advance on Port Arthur. By late May, General Oku began to hear rumors the Russians were performing an advance, so he dispatched the 1st Cavalry Brigade of Major General Akiyama to investigate the area of Telissu. The Japanese war plan at this moment was gradually to bring 3 of their armies together to confront the Manchurian army. The first target would be Liaoyang, but to advance to Liaoyang, there were some very large mountain ranges in the way. These were the Huxiongyaoshan and Fushaoling. The 1st and 4th IGA would have to pass through the passes of each mountain, those being Motian and Funchui passes. The Russians had heavily fortified both positions. Meanwhile, Akiyama's cavalry reached Telissu on May the 30th, and he ran into a Russian cavalry brigade led by General Samsonov. This began a small-scale battle where both sides were attacking another while simultaneously trying to reinforce their position. The 2nd Squadron of the 13th IJ Cavalry Regiment were charged upon their left flank by 2 squadrons of the 8th Siberian Cossacks to shocking effect. The Japanese would note the Cossacks used their lances to excellent effect. Casualties were not heavy, but the Japanese understood in the realm of cavalry they were simply outmatched. Thus the Japanese cavalry soon took up a position along the mountains where they could dismount and fight like dragoons. On June the 3rd, General Akiyama reported back to Oku that elements of the 1st Siberian Army Corps were entering Telissu. Oku ordered Akiyama to pull out swiftly. On the 5th, Stackelberg arrived to Telissu as the main body of the 1st Siberian Corps were getting off trains. Stackelberg ordered Samsonov to take his cavalry and to fortify a position 5 miles to the south. Basically, Stackelberg was leapfrogging towards Port Arthur, using the railway as a general path of advance. On the 6th, Oku received a report of the cavalry advance, and now the Japanese were beginning to see the Russians were trying to rescue Port Arthur. IJ General HQ then sent orders to ramp up activity to weaken Stackelberg's advance. Until this point, the 1st and 4th IGA had been generally performing an offensive. However, the 1st IGA were not exactly in a position to do so. The 10th Division were still unloading at Takushan. To compensate, General Kuroki was given a Guards Brigade and ordered to seize Hushien. Kuroki attacked Hushien, easily dislodging a force led by Mishenka on June the 8th. Now, back at Telissu, Stackelberg received reports on June the 13th that over 20,000 Japanese were advancing north from Pulansien. He believed these reports to be an exaggeration, so he sent 3 Cossack squadrons to investigate. On that same day, Oku's supplies had finally arrived and his 2nd IGA were able to begin their advance towards Liaoyang. The Cossacks saw the movement and came back to report it to Stackelberg, who quickly abandoned his offensive to instead await the enemy at their prepared defensive positions south of Telissu. By the early morning of the 14th, the Japanese were 14 miles away from the forward Russian trenches. Now, if you were to pull out a map of Telissu, there is a river, the Fuchou, that heads in its direction. South and parallel to this is the railway going directly through Wafangtian, then through Telissu. General Stackelberg deployed his troops astride the railway. To the west of the railway was the understrength 9th East Siberian Rifle Division, 5 battalions and 2 batteries. East of the railway was the bulk of his forces, the 1st East Siberian Rifle Division of 12 battalions and 4 batteries. Lieutenant General Simonov arrived to the scene to take command of the 19 cavalry squadrons previously under Samsonov. His position would be to the right of the Russian line. 2 regiments of the 9th East Siberian Division and a regiment of the 3rd Siberian Infantry Division were en route by rail. The Japanese, as usual, enjoyed exact details of the Russian order of battle via their spy network. Oku had his 3rd and 5th Divisions perform a frontal attack, with the railway being a divisional boundary line. His 4th Division was to perform a sweep going around the Fuchou Valley from the west to hit the Russians' right flank. So if you were looking at this on a map, basically the east had a Russian division with 4 batteries facing a Japanese division with a cavalry brigade, and in the west the Russians had a brigade with 2 batteries, 19 cavalry squadrons to face off against 2 full Japanese divisions. The Russian defenses were lines of trenches running for 8.5 miles. The shelter trenches were 9 inches deep with 15 inches of parapet. Riflemen would be crouched shoulder to shoulder with no overhead cover. Below the Russians, the valley afforded the attacker decent covered approaches, thus poor fields of fire for the defender. To the south, there were some hills that provided a screen the Japanese could use to conceal their movements. As was the case with most of the battles in this war, it was to be won and lost by artillery. The Russian senior artillery officers insisted their guns could only be effective firing upon stationary targets from covered positions. The junior officers, however, thought this was folly, but they were obliged to do as they were told. The brand new Russian quick-firing gun would appear for the first time in this battle, but would not be used very effectively. The major problem was that of training. The Russian artillery crews had only had these guns for 4 months, and as one military observer noted, "In many, if not in most cases, had not carried out any practice with them. The supply of ammunition was no doubt a factor as well." The men simply did not really understand the enormous capability the new weapon held, because if used effectively, the Japanese really had no way to counter it. On the morning of the 14th, the 3 Japanese divisions advanced. The 3rd and 5th kept in visual contact along the railway as the 4th moved further northwest to perform the hook attack. The 6th Division was just beginning to land, and Oku ordered them to immediately come over to build up his reserve. By the day of the battle, 2 battalions would make it up to his reserve. The advance of the Japanese had been quite fast, taking the Russians off guard. The Russians were unable to lay out their telephone lines in time and would be at the mercy of runners. The Russian screening forces were gradually brushed aside until at 2 p.m. when the Japanese ran into Russian artillery fire in the center. The Japanese artillery of the 3rd Division responded, trying to tease out the Russian artillery positions. By 3 p.m., an artillery duel was raging on. Oku's scouts re-estimated the Russians to be 3 divisions strong. Oku was very well aware every hour that passed was an hour more the Russians would receive reinforcements traveling via the railway. On the 15th, 3,000 infantry and 2 more artillery pieces would arrive to the scene. While the artillery duel raged on, probing attacks were launched by the 34th IGA Regiment against the left part of the Russian line. The 1st and 2nd East Siberian Regiments had to consolidate to repel the attack, but in doing so, the 2nd East Siberian Regiment took heavy casualties. By midday, the 4th IGA Division arrived to the scene and took up a position on the left bank of the Fucho River. Their commander, General and Baron Ogawa, read his orders at 5 a.m. on June the 15th from Oku. "As no danger is to be anticipated from the direction of the valley of the Fucho River, you will detach a force of at least 1 brigade of infantry, which will attack the enemy's right flank and help the advance of the other divisions." Ogawa ordered his men to clear the town of Fucho. The Russians would have been able to see this action using heliographs, but there was a large fog concealing the region. Now, Stackelberg did not like his subordinate Samsonov. He had very little confidence in the man's ability, and that of his Cossack cavalry. In fact, when a British military observer was touring the defensive lines with Stackelberg, he pointed out how vulnerable his right flank looked, and Stackelberg remarked, "I have a cavalry squadron or so near Fucho, but if 3 Japanese squadrons advance, mine will retire without finding out the Japanese strength." During the night of the 14th, that said cavalry had actually discovered the Japanese advance upon their right flank, and sent word of this to Stackelberg's chief of staff. The exact same British military observer happened to be present in the HQ at the time, and he recalled, "The chief of staff was told it was a report from Samsonov. It spoke of the Japanese advancing against their right flank. I thought to myself that his chief of staff had mentioned the possibility to me, and would be glad to hear the news. My companion replied that Samsonov's cavalry were completely useless, and he did not intend to worry Stackelberg about the message." At 3:30 p.m., Oku established his new HQ at Wafangtien. By 11 p.m., he ordered his 2 divisions on the left to perform an attack, on the Russian left and center, up the line of the railway set for the dawn of the 15th. While the Russians would be concentrating upon their left, the 5th Division, supported by elements of the 4th, would turn their right flank. Stackelberg, seeing the presence on his left, ordered the commander of his reserves, Major General Glasgow, to move from the center to the left. Glasgow arrived at 6 p.m. and he placed himself under the command of Major General Gerngross, who was then commanding the 1st Division. Thus, 3/4 of the Russian strength was now focused in the east, No reserves were available to support the West until the anticipated reinforcements would arrive by rail that very night. Both Oku and Stackelberg were planning to perform counterstrokes at dawn on the 15th. Now, for those of you who don't know, a counterstroke is not like a counterattack. It differs as it's aimed generally at the destruction of enemy forces rather than the seizure of territory. Thus, you seek to block the enemy advance with a strong defensive line and then hit the enemy flank with a hammer to cause as many casualties as possible. Counterstrokes are quite difficult to pull off. They heavily depend on opportunism and, quite honestly, boldness of commanders. Frequently in history, you see counterstrokes occur just when some fresh reinforcements arrive to the scene of battle. Now, it's not like General Stackelberg issued some operational order for a counterstroke. What he did do was send various commanders separate memoranda. Thus, one commander did not know what the other was to do. The memoranda stated that the operation would begin between 1 and 2 a.m. on the 15th, but in any event before daybreak. The exact timing was left to the mutual agreement of the commanders like Glasgow and Gerngross, who were commanding over 16 battalions, half of the infantry on the Russian side. The orders were passed down through the night. Men savored their rolled cigarettes. Those in the front trenches ate a black bread around dusk. The Russians in the forward positions could hear the Japanese preparing themselves, and everyone was quite anxious. At 2 a.m., some shots were fired from nervous Russian positions, starting a fusillade along the entire line. The Japanese advanced during the night closer to the Russian lines as the Russian officers barked at their men to restore order. No one got any sleep that night. At 4 a.m., the battlefield had a large mist hit it. General Gerngross decided his counterstroke would begin at 4 a.m. He sent word to Stackelberg of his decision and awaited his commander's approval. So, to reiterate, Gerngross sent word of his decision, but it's not like he asked, "Do you approve?" He simply expected Stackelberg to reply, "I approve." To complicate things further, Glasgow sent a runner to Gerngross asking him what his orders were, since Gerngross was his superior. But Gerngross had not received a reply from Stackelberg. Stackelberg, probably a bit confused, did not want to intervene in his subordinate's operation. The man probably assumed, as any of us would, that Gerngross was going through with what he had said he was going to do. It was then 6:40 a.m. Nothing had been done. Glasgow spoke with his staff, and they decided they had to take matters into their own hands. They would start an attack. It was at that moment orders finally arrived from Gerngross confirming the attack and that he had promised support. As the troops set off, suddenly another runner showed up with a new order from Glasgow from Stackelberg, reading, "If the Japanese advance with superior force against our center, or in any other direction, the corps will fall back slowly to Wachianling. In this case, Major General Glasgow will hold the line at Kuropatkin to Chaotun as long as possible, in order to give the troops falling back by Telissu time to traverse and defile the north of Tsuchatun. Should the Japanese retire, the troops will halt and await further order." Needless to say, it's never a great thing when a commander is about to begin an attack, and his superior is advising easing on the gas pedal and potentially withdrawing. The situation became confused very quickly. Glasgow frantically called back his troops and ordered them to occupy the Kuropatkin-Tsuchatun line. Meanwhile, Gerngross, completely unaware of any changes in orders, ordered his men to attack at 7 a.m., expecting and depending on Glasgow's men for support. Gerngross's 3 infantry regiments advanced over 1,500 yards in 3 echelons. This resulted in only a third of his force being able to fire at any given time. The 3rd IGA Division within their trenches were surprised by the attack. Now, General Glasgow received orders yet again to go forward, but the Russian artillery was petering out and the Japanese were growing stronger. General Yuda, leading the 5th IGA Division, heard news of the Russian attacks and determined to take matters into his own hands. He had his artillery cross the river at 7 a.m. and he began smashing Simonov's cavalry. Simonov, believing he was only to perform delaying actions, pulled back northwest, thereby exposing the right flank of the Russian infantry lines. As the 5th Division were battering the Russian forces, the 4th Division arrived to the scene to add their weight against the thinly held Russian position. Soon the Russian right flank was being overwhelmed. At 11 a.m., Stackelberg received a distressing message that had originated back at 6 a.m. from his so-called useless cavalry. It stated a strong force of Japanese were advancing southwest of Telissu. At that moment, Stackelberg had a reserve of 2 battalions and another 2 battalions detraining at Telissu Station. In a courageous manner, Stackelberg gathered the 4 battalions and personally launched an attack against the forward elements attacking his right flank. As brave as he was too late to stop the inevitable. Stackelberg had 2 horses shot from right under him before he issued the orders to retreat at 11:30 a.m. West of the railway line, the Russian artillery was improving and the infantry lines were holding firm. The fighting became so fierce in the west, the lines converged and the men began to run out of ammunition and reportedly began tossing rocks at each other. General Oku was forced to toss half of his reserves to assist the Western Front. Meanwhile, Glasgow's advance had been delayed because his artillery crews were having trouble with the terrain. Glasgow had given them orders to advance against the Japanese right flank to support Gerngross's 1st East Siberian Rifle Division. For most of the morning, Gerngross's attention was fixated at the developing threat west of the railway. Gradually, Gerngross's artillery became exposed and systematically annihilated. Gerngross's right flank were being subjected to enfilade artillery and rifle fire from the 5th IJ Division, causing tremendous casualties. Glasgow's forces failed to arrive to save Gerngross. Thus, on his own initiative, by midday, he ordered his division to withdraw. This order coincided with Glasgow's delayed advance, which ran directly into the 1st Japanese Cavalry Brigade, advancing to the right of the 3rd IJA Division. The fierce Japanese advance was far too much for his force, so he also began withdrawing. At around 2 p.m., General Oku received word more forces were reaching the battlefield, so he finally tossed his last reserve battalion to help the 3rd Division, pressing home the attack. 4 batteries passed through the railway gap at 2 p.m., taking a position at Longwangmiao, which was the initial forward Russian line of defense. The artillery crews found abandoned Russian guns everywhere. Below them, heading north, were 4 regiments of the 1st East Siberian Rifle Division. The Japanese batteries unleashed shrapnel upon them in revenge for the hours that it was tossed back at them. From the east and west, the Russians were now contracting to the center. Stackelberg was personally directing the withdrawal from the west, but around Telissu, the bulk of his corps were being hit with artillery without mercy. The acting rearguard, the 9th East Siberian Rifle Division, courageously held the heights west of the Telissu railway station to give the men a chance at evacuating the carnage. At 2 p.m., the whistling of a steam locomotive announced the arrival of 2 remaining battalions of the 9th East Siberian Infantry Regiment, coming from Kaiping. As the men were jumping off the train carts, they were literally being hit with artillery, and soon the Japanese were surrounding the position. Talk about entering a battlefield. The transport corps blocked the route at Panlanshan, thus trying to exit north was impossible now. The 1st East Siberian Division were fleeing for their lives under Japanese artillery heading east, and for many days they would be hunted down. By 3 p.m., the battle had become a catastrophe for the Russians. Like a miracle, torrential rain began to fall. Visibility fell dramatically. Stackelberg managed to salvage what remained of his army, and they marched them over to Kaiping. Ultimately, the battle was lost because Stackelberg was unaware of the Japanese buildup against his right flank. With the loss at Telissu, the Russian attempt to relieve Port Arthur had failed. The Japanese had 217 deaths, 946 wounded. For the Russians, it was 477 dead and 2,240 wounded, with another 754 missing. Russian morale was falling apart, while the Japanese felt like superhumans. When the news reached St. Petersburg, the government and its people were becoming numb to such terrible news from the East. Things were a disaster in the East, but back home in Russia, discontent was turning into a hateful fever amongst the common people who would eventually rise up. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I've just released an episode in both French and English on France's role during the Pacific War. Also, if you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, I have just released a new exclusive podcast about Yang Kyung-jung, the Korean man who fought for the Japanese, the Soviets, and then the Germans during World War II. But is his story real? Come find out. Kuropatkin never wanted to go on the offensive, and when forced to do so, everything turned to ruin. Stackelberg and his men fought bravely, but one major oversight cost them the battle at Telissu, and thus Port Arthur was now on her own.